if you want to use this way and send data to your components, how would we do that, right? So let's take a look at that. And in honor of Rain All Day Long, who's asking questions, we'll use a component store to do it. That should be fun. We'll add a component store to our dynamic component host, and we'll send some data to our components and use that data in our components. Just going over chat, has the API for standalone components changed much between 14 and 15? The things that have changed between 14 and 15 are things like, so in 14, there was no way to really do HTTP clients in a purely standalone application. In 15, they've added use HTTP client. So one of the cool things about standalone is you use kind of these builders to build things up. So if you want to do routing, you do with routing. If you want to do it, very, very similar to the way .NET works when you build up an application, right? So you have your application and then you do with with Swagger, with cores, with this, right? And you add these things, and then inside of there you add other options. That's the way things work in standalone components too. That's the only thing that I'm aware of that's changed, is there were a couple of things you couldn't do in 14 that 15 makes available. The Angular doc says it's in beta. I was very, very hesitant to do it too. One of the things about being a content creator is you need to be showing like the newer stuff, right? And so I was kind of pushed into it. Once I took the plunge, I love it. It's very hard for me to develop even a scam component. I like standalone components so much. Let's see how far we can take this dynamic host component. I've only got a half hour, and it's going to take longer than a half hour to build a form. So let's see how we would overcome some of these what do we want to call them? But some of the hurdles that you might have, right? Let's say in component 1, we want to get a user to that component 1. So we'll add a username that we can change for component 1. In component 2, we'll do something else, and in component 3, we'll do something else. But we'll use a component store to do that. So to use a component store, we're going to stop serving our application. Interesting. One thing I want to do is I want to pin node. And we will say that we want node at greater than 1610. And by pinning this, what happens with Volta is that as soon as you come into this directory, anybody who has Volta installed will get node 16.18.1. And if it's not installed, Volta will just go download it and install it. And then that's the version of node you'll be using. So one of the reasons why I like package managers, I know NVM does the very same thing. And if you saw me type CLS, you know just how old of a programmer I am, because CLS used to stand for clear screen, and in most CLIs, you would type CLS. So within NGRX data, no, that's not the one we want. We want the component store. So normally we would just do ng add ngrx component store at latest, and that would install a whole bunch of stuff for us. It would run some Angular generators. So npm install, and we want at ngrx/component store. But I want the Angular generator that runs. So I think it's nxg. And let's see. I can just look it up here, right? Oh, there it is right there. So what we're looking for is normally when you run this, so if you were to run ng add, it would tell you to run the npm install. And then after you run the npm install, it would tell you to run the ng add generator. Luckily, I've got history turned on in my terminal, and I can turn this on and off with F2. Um, if you guys want to know how to do this, Tim DeShriver has an amazing blog post. I'll see if I can find it and put it on Twitter. But if you're using Windows, it's a good thing to have. So we want the ngrx/ComponentStore, and then we just run the ng-add generator. And what this is going to do for us is it's going to run the stuff that ng-add would do. So now it's going to install the npm packages, updated our package.json, and I think it added a couple of other things. Let's just make sure. So if we look at our package.json, no, that's all it added. So there's our post install. And in our host component, yeah, so we're gonna say we added ngrx component store. And then here, we're just gonna say that we cleaned up button text. So there's that. So now we want to add a component store. So we're going to swap over to VS Code. And in VS Code, we're going to add, well, what I like to do when I do component stores is I actually like to add them next to the component that they'll be injected in. And the reason I do that is that when I look for the component store, it's right there by the component. So we'll be injecting this in the dynamic host. So we're going to generate a service. Yep, from schematics Angular. Our service. Well, you know what? I want to see something. NX generate. Can I generate a component store? Maybe, but it's not here. So we'll just generate a typical service. The name of the service will be our dynamic host. And yeah, it'll be a flat service. So here's our component store. And component stores are just services, but we'll do a couple of things with them. So there we go. We will minimize this. We will go over here. And the first thing I want to do is instead of dynamic host service, we're going to call this dynamic host store. Dynamic host store. Yes, I want to rename the files. Here, we're going to take off the dot service, and I like to add the dot store here. So we'll refactor that. Here, we're also going to rename this file, and instead of service, we'll do store. Great, and I think everything is how I want it. So this will extend component store, and we'll import that. So if we go look, and I always have to look this up. So with the component store, we've got the art installation. So once we got it set up, we need to have a state. And so component store is a generic. We need to have a state. So we'll create our state. And so up here, what we will do is we will export interface. We'll call this the dynamic. Well, we can call, yeah, we'll call it dynamic host state. And in our state, so for component one, we'll have a user, and a user can have, we'll give them a first name, which is a string, last name, which is also a string, and we'll give them an age, which will be a number, right? So this is our user state. The other thing I like to do is just inside of here, I like to const initial state. And I like to make my initial state a function, mainly because I like to avoid, I like my state to be as immutable as possible. So if I make my initial state a function, I'm less likely to modify it, right? So our default user will be first name, Jason, last name Warner, and age will make me 100 years old because I always wanted to live to be 100. So here we've got our component store, and this will extend our dynamic host state. We don't want our injectable to have the provided in. We want to have to inject it. Don't ask me that again. We want to have to inject it ourselves. And that's why I put my stores next to where they're going to be injected. Because I want my store to be, you know, when I'm looking at the dynamic host component, I can see that there's the store that's injected. We're in a good place. So the last thing we need to do is we need to add a constructor. And you can see I've done this a couple of times because it knows that it just needs to call super with initial state. So there we go. Here's our dynamic host store. We will extend this a little bit more, but this is where we'll start. So we've got our dynamic host store. Now we go to our dynamic host component. Here's another change that if you're going to Angular 15 or beyond, I recommend that you do. Typically in Angular, what you would do to inject something is, you would have your constructor, you would do private read only, and this would be our dynamic host store of type dynamic host store, right? And this is the typical way that you do injection. The problem with this is that then, oh, you know what? I need to do more in the store. I need a selector, right? So I need read only user equals this dot select, and we're going to say state, and state is going to give us state dot user. Great. And it should be user $. And my ESLint is definitely not working. There's something messed up in this because it should be complaining about the order that I'm putting things in. But whatever. This is where it typically wants us to be. So now we have the user. So this now allows me to show what the problem is here, right? So typically what you would do is you would inject your store. And one other thing we need to do is we need to add a providers array. And here we are going to add our dynamic host store. And the reason we're going to do that is we need to tell the dependency injection where dynamic host store will be provided. So anything underneath dynamic host component will get this instance of dynamic host store. Anything outside of here won't have it. But going back to this issue right here, right? So if I want to do user, typically what we would do is we would do this dot underscore dynamic host store dot user, right? So we're getting the selector off of the host store. There's a problem with this. And the problem we have is at this point, the user, well, in the future, there are changes to TypeScript that make this problematic. This is the best way to say it. So the changes, what they're going to do is they're going to change the way that user is set up as a property, and it's going to be evaluated before dynamic host store is set by the DI. So when this compiles, dynamic host store will be undefined, which will then say it can't find user on undefined. We've got a problem, right? But we don't want to do this here. We want to do this in component 1. So in component 1, we're going to go in here. We've already injected our store in the dynamic host component. So we're going to get that from the dependency injection in a safe way going forward. The way we're going to do that is we're just going to set up a private variable, and this will be our dynamic, and it doesn't have to be private. So this is our dynamic host store, and it is going to use the inject function that was added in Angular 14 also. And with the inject function, we can now grab the dynamic host store. And this is done in a safe way. This dynamic host store will be run during the constructor. The thing to know about inject is it has to be run during the construction phase. If you try to use inject outside of the constructor phase, you're going to get an error. When we're setting a property, these properties are syntactic sugar. What it does is it creates the property, and then inside of the constructor, it evaluates it. So, well, you know what? Let's go look at this. Right? Let's go to the TypeScript playground. And in the TypeScript playground, we'll take a look at how this works, right? So let's expand this a little bit, and we'll just create a class. We're going to call it test. And right here in test, we'll just say private var var1 equals, well, I don't need the private there. var1 equals var1. So notice that when this compiles, what this does is us declaring this here, and it's creating this variable, right? This is really interesting. What version of TypeScript? Oh, I'm using ECMAScript 2017. Let's go to 2020, because that's the most common one. Oh no, 2022. So you have to be on 2022 for this to work. Interesting. But 2020 is the most common one for people to be using in Angular right now. This is a little bit strange the way it's doing it. How it's keeping this as a private variable because it's creating test var1 as a weak map. So notice that it declares the variable. In the constructor, it sets the variable, and then down here it does a weak map. If we change this over to 2022 or ES next, which a lot of people have that set, notice again, the constructor sets the value, but we declare the property on the class, right? There's some flags that we could turn on to make it behave the way the other one works. But just so you know, when you're declaring variables like this, it's just syntactic sugar, right? When it compiles down to JavaScript, it adds the property and then it sets the property in the constructor. If we go back and we add a public variable, right? var2 equals public var. You'll see that it doesn't add the property because it doesn't have to keep it private, and it just sets it on the constructor. And you know, if we go back to like ES 2020, still the same thing, right? It just sets it on in the constructor. So anything you declare and assign immediately is moved into the constructor. Notice that if we add var3 and make that optional, and we make this one a Boolean, nothing's added to the code, right? Because var3 in JavaScript, we can just add it at any point in time. It's just TypeScript that cares about it. So, you know, just a quick little TypeScript lesson for you guys about how we know that by doing this, inject is run in the constructor. So there we go. We've now injected it in the dynamic store. So let's, well, the first thing we can do is let's grab the component1.scss. And inside of here, we'll make this display grid. And we're going to go grid template rows. And our first row, we'll say it can be 20 characters. And our second row, or the second part of our row, will be one fraction, which will take up the remaining amount. We're also going to say that this is a width of 100%. And we're doing this on purpose. So now we've got that. That should be all we need. The other thing we can do is we can say, we can give ourselves a class, and we can say label is going to be font weight bold, sure. And then, yeah, that'll work. So now we can go back to our component one, and we can take this out, and instead we can do something like this. Because we've set up a grid, oh, there's one last thing we want to do in the grid. We want to give it a gap. So we'll give it a gap of, we'll do 0.5 rem. Nah, we'll do 0.25. We'll do half that. That should be enough. So inside of our template now, we can do div, and we can do div.label. We'll say first name here. And then we can also do another div. And here we can do, well, we'll add another thing to it. So we've got the dynamic host store. We need our user, right? So our user is going to be this.dynamic-host-store.user. So we need to get this user into the template, right? I could do user $, you know, and do an async all over the place. But what we can do is we can do an ng container, and here we can do an ngrx let, which is another pipe from ngrx component, and it's like using an ng if, but has some benefits to it. So we can say ngrx let user as user. And so anything inside of this container will be in that scope. So the next thing we can do is we can move our stuff up in here, and we could say user dot first name. And we need to make sure that we're using the accessor. This can be undefined, right? ngrx let will return the value or undefined. So let's copy this a couple of times, and we'll grab the last name here, and we will grab the age here. So now we've got our last name and our age. So now we have a dynamic component that can be fed data. And we can feed data to it through the store. So if we update the store, our component will update. I'll just show you how this works, right? We will definitely be picking this up because there's a whole bunch more that we can explore with dynamic components. We've just barely scratched the surface. And there are some incredible things we can do. But one thing I do want to point out is if we're looking at the stuff that's built, and this grid looks silly because I've expanded the font size. But look at our main.js. It's 15K. It's growing a little bit. But component 1 added another 5K, right? So we essentially doubled the size of what component 1 was before, but we haven't added anything to the main. And so by using the import statement in this way, we can generate lazy bundles on the fly, right? And if we need services and stuff, they can be added in here too. But part of the reason we increased the size is we added the component store and things like that. But again, we're staying fairly small, right? This was 14K before. We haven't added much to it, but we've added a whole bunch more to the to our abilities. So now I need to refresh this, I think. And when we load component 1, oh, that doesn't work. Why is that not working? Oh, you know why that doesn't work? It's not a grid template rows, it's grid column template, I think. There we go. Yeah, it needs to be grid template columns. So let's go back and clean that up just so that it actually works. So here in component 1, and I'm looking in the wrong thing again. So let's grab that. In our SCSS, this isn't the rows, it's the columns. And we can shorten this. We can make this like 15 characters, and then it'll take up the rest. So now when we load component 1, notice that we get the first name, last name, and age already. We can look at using the component store to update from the dynamic component. We can update the first name, the last name, and the age, and we can see in component 1 that will update, right? When we load component 2, or component 3, right? And the cool thing about this is that it's the user that's completely driving this. You know, I'm the one that's typing in 1 and hitting the button, which I really like. I like the fact that with dynamic components, you can, let's add 0.25 rem spacing here, just for the padding. I want it to be, you know, a little bit away. So there we go. But yeah, we were able to dynamically load a component and then feed it data. And this is one way to do it, right? So from your server, you could get a list of components that you need to load. And we'll look at how we can do that in the future, right? Eventually, what I want to do is just have like an input box here where we can enter in some JSON. And then we'll use Zod to verify that the JSON is good. And if the JSON's good, then we'll load up a whole bunch of components. And, you know, we're already part way there. We've got a display only version, right? This could be a component that we're adding to a form that, you know, in its display only version, this is what we see. And then we could click a button, flop to edit version, and these all turn into inputs.